So whenever you are launching a new product or you are entering into a new market, you first have to understand all these 5 important forces which are there in the market. So let's quickly have a look at the Porter 5 forces. Now these 5 forces will help you understand how exactly your strategy will look like in that specific market. So if you're launching a new product into the market, there is always a chance when a new product or new competitor will come into the market. So there is always a threat of new entrants. Then you have bargaining power of customer. So obviously if customer have multiple choice, they will always do bargaining related to your product, which means they'll not purchase your product if they find a better product of other competitor. So customer too have a bargaining power. Then you have a threat of substitute. So if your product have one more substitute, maybe that can be related substitute or unrelated substitute. If your product have a substitute in the market, obviously people will not purchase your product. Then you also have to understand competitive rivalry. So if you have a lot of competition or existing player in the market, that will also affect your sales or your product launch. Then you also have bargaining power of supplier. So let's say if all the competitors have a common supplier, then that common supplier will always ask for higher price from all the competitors. So you always need to make a strategy when you have a supplier which will give you raw material much cheaper than your other competitor's supplier. So you also have to look into that perspective. So let's quickly understand Porter 5 forces with the help of an example, and then we'll come back and discuss these things. So let's quickly understand Porter 5 forces with the help of an example. I'm not a big fan of discussing theory because I feel once you understand the core thesis of the topic, then theory is not a big deal. Now let's understand Porter 5 forces in an airline industry and in an e-commerce business. So let's say you have two choices, whether to invest that much amount of capital in an airline business or in an e-commerce business. I know that's a very stupid example to compare, but let's quickly have a look and understand two extreme situations. And let's understand Porter 5 forces in an airline business and in an e-commerce business. Let's quickly start with our first force, which is threat of new entrants. Now, if you wanted to start an e-commerce business, you can start your e-commerce store within 30 minutes with the help of Shopify. But on the other side, if you wanted to start your airline business, you literally have to purchase an Airbus 320. And this is going to cost you around maybe 60, 70, 80 million dollars. That means there is always a threat of someone entering into your e-commerce business, but there are very less chance that other people will come into your airline business. Then let's understand bargaining power of customer. So obviously in an e-commerce business, you have to do predatory pricing. So you have to sell your product much cheaper than your competitor. So let's say if you have 4 or 5 different people selling the product into the same e-commerce category, you have to sell your product at the cheapest rate possible. Otherwise, other people will sell their product to those people and then win the game. But in the airline industry, if you're booking a ticket, if you're traveling from, let's say, location A to location B, or let's say from LA to Texas, then you can always have 4 or 5 choices in front of you. And those choices are very limited. So you have those customers have less bargaining power in airline, but they always have more bargaining power in the e-commerce industry because they can go to Amazon, they can just do a Google search, and they can purchase multiple products at the better price. But for airline, you only have 5 to 6 options to travel from location A to location B. Then you have threat of substitute. Now, obviously, there are always two kind of threat. You always have a direct substitute and you have indirect substitute. Now, there is always two kind of threat. You will always have a direct threat and an indirect threat. So let's say if you're launching an expensive coffee brand and instead of people purchasing your coffee, they will go for tea. Now that's an indirect competition or substitute. So obviously in e-commerce, people have very high threat of substitute. But for aviation, you have less threat of substitute. Because obviously if you have to travel through air, I mean, if you travel through train, you end up spending more time. You have to like maybe allocate 1 or 2 days if you wanted to travel, let's say 2,000 or 3,000 miles. It's quite a long distance. So you may not have so many substitute in the airline industry. You have to travel through air if you wanted to cover a very long distance in a shorter span of time. Then you have bargaining power of supplier. So obviously in airline, you only have 2 commercial carrier manufacturer, Boeing and Airbus, and you may not have so many options in airline. So all these airline companies have such a limited choice in their hand. So in terms of bargaining power, e-commerce have low bargaining power, because if Shopify is increasing their price, obviously you can always choose WooCommerce or Square, Space, or maybe Wix. You can choose any platform you want. So all these e-commerce players have low bargaining power, but in airline, there are only two companies which make commercial airline weekly, Boeing and Airbus. And those two companies have very high bargaining power. That's why you will see all these commercial aircraft. These are very expensive. I mean, you have to pay $70-80 million to get one commercial aircraft. So usually all these airline companies take all these commercial aircraft on a lease of 5, 10, 15 years. Now let's look at the last one, which is the competitive rivalry. So e-commerce industry have intense competition. So you have all these different players from Amazon to all these different Shopify store, and you have to literally compete with them in terms of price. And aviation have medium to low competition depending on geography to geography. So in US, you have more number of airline companies. In other countries, in developing countries, you have less number of airline companies. So the market is not matured enough. So that's how the complete Porter 5 force situation will look like in airline and e-commerce industry. Which means if you wanted to enter into e-commerce industry into any specific segment, you have to understand all these 5 forces which are there into the market. So as a manager in a company, you can always do this Porter 5 force for your company. If your company is entering into a new market or into a new domain or a new product line or a business, you can always do Porter 5 force analysis to understand all these different parties which are also there in the market.